I'm Em, and today we're going to be talking about vampires and tuberculosis, Foucault's clinical gaze in the 19th century and early 20th century. Tuberculosis and vampirism have stalked humanity for millennia. All along, we have attempted to thwart these vectors of death. To this pursuit, the 19th century contributed the professionalization of the medical field through the establishment of certifying associations, the persecution of midwives and other healers, and the increased understanding of microscopic bacteria. These developments enabled the social control practices observed and replicated in Bram Stoker's Dracula, and Ellen N. Lamott's The Tuberculosis Nurse, Her Function and Her Qualifications. This talk argues that Foucault's clinical gaze is deployed both by the medical practitioners of Dracula, Dr. Seward and Van Helsing, and the tuberculosis nurses, their supervising physicians, and the U.S. Health Department. While tuberculosis still raged and the medical profession had recently become prestigious, the medical elite grasped at what power they could using the clinical gaze. The ill body, however, refused to be wholly subjugated by these practices, and both Lucy Westenra, of Dracula, and tubercular patients often succeeded in existing unobserved and uncontrolled, thus demonstrating the ongoing limitations of medical power and the patient's potential to push back against the relatively recently established superiority of the doctor in the doctor-patient relationship. Tellingly, present-day doctor-patient interactions continue to undermine the experientially gained epistemologies of the chronically ill in favor of the impersonal control of the clinical gaze. Constant surveillance as a technology of the clinical gaze was first enacted by medical practitioners themselves, though it was later expanded to grant the patient's family, friends, neighbors, and coworkers with a simulation of its power. As Foucault notes in The Birth of the Clinic, the years preceding and immediately following the Revolution saw the birth of two great myths with opposing themes and polarities. The myth of a nationalized medical profession organized like the clergy and invested at the level of a man's bodily health with powers similar to those exercised by the clergy over men's souls. And the myth of a total disappearance of disease in an untroubled, dispassionate society restored to its original state of health. Thus did 19th century medical practitioners see themselves as the chief observers and therefore controllers of the ill body. As the medical field became more professional through the development of medical schools and medical licenses, so too did it become more comprehensive in its observatory abilities. No longer did patients need to summon a medical authority in order to be observed. Lamott's work documents the ways and means by which nurses arrived at patients' homes uninvited in order to bring them under the clinical gaze of physicians, dispensaries, hospitals, and finally, the health department. In Dracula, Lucy Westenra is the third, after Jonathan and Renfield, to be brought under the surveillance of the medical elite. After her friend, Mina Murray, can no longer watch Lucy all day and night, Arthur Godalming, Lucy's fiancé, insists on placing Lucy in the charge of his dear friend, the psychiatrist, Dr. Seward. The remainder of her life is then composed of a series of successful or failed moments of surveillance until she finally dies, apparently from the consequences of existing outside of the clinical gaze. Van Helsing assumes possession of Lucy's autonomy when he takes his turn watching Lucy all night. Though he is present all night and therefore ostensibly capable of surveilling and thereby keeping Lucy safe, his vigilance is not constant, and Lucy is allowed to wake and possess autonomy of her own. She writes, "I found him asleep twice when I awoke, but I did not fear to go to sleep again, although the boughs or the bats or something rapped almost angrily against the window panes." Though Lucy readily admits that Van Helsing's presence and potential surveillance is comforting to her, she also reveals to the reader that her disease, Dracula, is more threatening and present when Van Helsing fails to observe her. Though Dracula does not attack Lucy on that evening, he succeeds in doing so on several other nights, when the medical men's surveillance slips, and Lucy is allowed to exist outside of the clinical gaze. One such night, Van Helsing writes an incomplete address on a telegram demanding that Dr. Seward take over the watch of their patient that same evening. This results in Lucy going unwatched for a night, affecting the results one might expect when the novel has set up so clearly and repeatedly the relationship between a lack of surveillance and immediate danger to the patient. Dr. Seward knows it too. On receiving the unfortunate telegram a day late, he writes in his diary, "A whole night lost, and I know by bitter experience what may happen in a night." Van Helsing and Seward's failing to keep strict watch over their patient has dire effects, and from this point forward in the novel, Lucy is dying. A few days later, she becomes a member of the undead. What is lost is not a whole night of Lucy's potential future life, which could not be predicted in number of days anyway, were she a real tubercular patient, but of the watching, the surveillance of the patient. Despite the medical men's best intentions, the ill body has gone unobserved for an entire evening. They have lost that time, and at least temporarily, the clinical gaze's power over her body. In missing a single night of their vigil, the ill body spirals past the control of medical intervention and into death and beyond. Lamott's nurses faced similar difficulties in maintaining a constant clinical gaze, though they attempted to bring as many tuberculosis cases under their watchful eyes as possible. Lamott writes, "The nurse is responsible for every consumptive in her district, and her constant endeavor should be to bring under supervision every case of tuberculosis that exists." The goal in doing so was the prevention of the spread of tuberculosis. Tuberculosis nurses acted on the belief that tubercular patients could be controlled and thereby made non-threatening through the application of the clinical gaze. This, of course, meant that the nurses worked constantly to discover suspicious cases and to force them to submit to testing, treatment, and quarantine when diagnosis was confirmed. Unfortunately for the prevention of contagious disease, the ill body is quite difficult to supervise, especially when it possesses chronic illness, such as tuberculosis or, indeed, vampirism. Tubercular patients often lived for decades after diagnosis, and so the continual supervision of their bodies would have been impossible to maintain, even by the most devoted of public servants, the tuberculosis nurse. Racist hiring practices, low wages, and dangerous work limited the tuberculosis nurse's ability to constantly supervise every patient, which led Lamott to write that no one knows better than the nurse herself the inadequacy, the futility of even the closest supervision. The nurse, who must sometimes go weeks without gazing upon her patient, must indeed feel that her ability to supervise them is severely limited. The nurses were not blamed, of course, for this limitation. The failing of medical institutions to gain complete supervision and therefore control over the ill body is instead attributed to its inherent volatility and corrupting influence. Lamott says, "They also show that the patient left in his own home, even under constant supervision, is unable to achieve a degree of technique which means positive protection to those around him. There is but one conclusion to be drawn from these facts, not that the nurse is useless, but that the patient at large is dangerous. It proves the necessity for hospital care." Constant supervision, when not possessed of sufficient medicalizing power, is not nearly enough. When hospitalized, tubercular patients would have been subject to the clinical gaze during all waking hours of the day and much of the night. Therefore, it is not just the constancy of the supervision, but also its quality of being possessed of the clinical gaze, which constant supervision at home could not adequately replicate. That is the deciding factor of whether a patient is truly dangerous to the community. So it was for Lucy, who, while living in the home under the care of her private physicians, family, and household staff, still expires apparently from a want of surveillance. It is small wonder that Lamott characterizes the unobserved disease as dangerous and monstrous. She says tuberculosis is like a concealed enemy, crouched and ready to spring at the moment one turns one's back, and it requires constant vigilance to guard against it. This description from Lamott is equally suited to the development of disease in the unobserved ill body as it is to Lucy's antagonist and source of disease, Dracula. Tuberculosis nurses do not subdue the ill body with medicine or treatment, but with the clinical gaze. This is not surveillance to ensure the safety and health of the sufferer, but instead surveillance to ensure that the disease, which is him or her, does not attack and spread to others. This is easily compared to Van Helsing's description of the undead. When they become such, there comes with the change the curse of immortality. They cannot die, but must go on age after age, adding new victims and multiplying the evils of the world. For all that die from the preying of the undead become themselves undead and prey on their kind. And so the circle goes on, ever widening, like as the ripples from a stone thrown in the water. To prevent the circle of dangerous tuberculars from ever widening, the nurse and her other medical elite attempted to keep all such afflicted people under their constant surveillance, to prevent them from becoming dangerous to those around them. Ostensibly, their goal was to educate the patient into behaving in ways that would prevent the spread of disease. In actuality, the nurse's, quote, chief, the absolutely most important duty of the nurse is to induce the infectious patient to go from his home into an institution. To accomplish this end, she must bring every effort to bear upon the patient and his family and appeal to them from every conceivable angle. This is her one great duty, the paramount reason for her existence. Unfortunately, tuberculosis nurses were not quite as successful as they might have hoped. As Anderson et al. Have found, based on these estimates, we conclude that the anti-tuberculosis measures introduced at the turn of the 20th century did not contribute substantially to the marked decline in the TB mortality rates in the United States. Thus, like Dr. Seward and Van Helsing, Lamott and her nurses failed to perform so complete a surveillance of their patients as to prevent their dying of or spreading their disease. So though the medical elite attempted to use the clinical gaze to obtain absolute power over the ill body and succeeded in obtaining a greater and more far-reaching surveillance than ever before, they ultimately failed in the absolute subjugation of the ill body to the clinical gaze. As Matthew Ramsey explains of the goals of the medical police in 19th century France, the principle of total surveillance, which Foucault has called panopticism, an allusion to Bentham's panopticon prison, found an almost rhapsodic expression in one early 19th century French handbook of jurisprudence. You can judge that no part of the empire escapes observation, that no crime, no offense, no infraction can remain unprosecuted, and that the eye of the genius who knows how to shed light on everything takes in the whole of this vast machine without, however, overlooking the least detail. The eye of the genius does not see all, however, and ill bodies continue to behave in ways antithetical to medical institutions' accumulation of power. Thus, though both Stoker and Lamott's works represent a cultural shift toward the increasing power of the medical elite, they simultaneously serve as testaments to 1. The frailty of this attempt at hegemony, and 2. The ease with which the ill body throws off the clinical gaze and exists in its wholeness, outside of and possessed of disease. Thank you for watching.